starting with Naomi Klein. Who apparently some of you have heard of. She is an award-winning journalist, columnist for The Nation, The Guardian, contributing editor to Harper's Magazine, on the board of 350.org. And as a writer, Naomi Klein has really made a unique contribution to the social movements of the past 15 years. When activists went into the streets to confront the World Trade Organization, the G8, and other institutions of global capitalism in the early 2000s, they did so informed and armed with the idea of no logo. Her best-selling book, published at the turn of the millennium and the height of the anti-globalization movement. When Chicago teachers went on strike, last in 2012, and won, by the way, they later said one of their formative experiences in preparing for the strike was setting up reading groups around her best-selling book, The Shock Doctrine, The Rise of Disaster Capitalism, published in 2007. And as we prepare to march tomorrow with tens of thousands and hopefully hundreds of thousands of others, every one of us should be buying our own copy of her vital new book, This Changes Everything, Capitalism versus the Climate. And as she says inside the cover, the problem is not carbon. The problem is capitalism. So not only should you buy it, but please buy it also for your family, co-workers, neighbors, friends, favorite pets. Yes, fortunately we are selling it here, so that's handy. So this is a profoundly important book that, like the Shock Doctrine, names capitalism front and center as the system that we have to confront and replace with a new economic system if we are to have any hope for our future, or for the future of our children, or millions of species on this planet. Without further ado, I give you Naomi Klein.
It's so wonderful to be part of this moment, this movement moment. A lot has changed just in a few years, and I think it wasn't so long ago that the left was leaving this issue to the big green groups, to the environmentalists, and it seemed like this was kind of like the one issue maybe we didn't have to worry about, you know? It was like, oh, those groups, they've got it covered, and they've got like more money than God, and you know, we've got our hands full, and so we'll just sit this one out. You know, as you've probably heard, I go after the big green groups pretty hard in this book, but I think that we need to be self-critical. It is not only that they screwed this up with their market mechanisms and shopping advice. It's also that this ground was ceded, and we're taking it back, are we not? The piece I have out today in The Guardian about the people's alarm and the fact that this is a moment where we are expressing urgency because that urgency is not being expressed by our leaders. What I say is that the real climate leaders obviously are not in the UN, they're in the streets. They're also in this room. There are incredible climate leaders in this room, people who have been my teachers recently in writing this book. I want to single out a couple of people here, Alexis Bonagowski and Mike Scott, who are incredible activists, ranchers as well, from Billings, Montana. And I met them just in the early days of starting to research this book, and they were basically the two hardest working activists I'd ever met. They were running around Montana playing whack-a-mole with fossil fuel projects. They just basically, you know, couldn't keep up with all the bad ideas that were coming their way. There was fracking, there were tar sands pipelines, there were new coal projects, there were coal railways leading to coal export terminals. There was a new coal to liquids plant. This is the process by which you create the dirtiest possible liquid fuel by liquefying coal. And over the course of writing this book, it's been amazing to watch so many of these fights that seemed sure to lose, to be turned into victories, or near victories. A huge amount has changed because of direct action, activism led by indigenous people in many cases, including in Montana. And I also want to recognize Vanessa Braided Hair from the Northern Cheyenne Reservation, who's been at the forefront of a fight to keep a huge amount of coal in the ground. And what they have found there is that one of the best tools for fighting the extraction of fossil fuels is building real alternatives, showing people that another economy is possible. And all of these wonderful people have been part of bringing solar energy, owned and controlled by the Northern Cheyenne, to the same territory that they want to mine for coal. And it's incredible the transformation when people can see what a genuinely non-extractive economy looks like. Not just not extracting the fossil fuels from the ground, but also not extracting the money from the territory. And leaving it in people's hands and leaving the power in their hands as well. I also want to recognize Des Desai, who's on this panel. Unfortunately, I'm not going to be able to stay, so I want to apologize in advance for leaving after my talk. As many of you know, this is a crazy week and things are triple booked, but I really wanted to be with you. But I wanted, all of these panelists are amazing, but I owe a special debt to Des, because 15 years ago he took me on a tour of Durban, and I learned what environmental racism was. I did not understand it up until that moment, up until I saw kids playing directly underneath the dirtiest refinery I've ever seen, a playground right up against it. The air is so fouler than anything I've ever smelled before. And it was a real wake-up for me. And so I remain extremely grateful. This is an incredible activist, an incredible teacher, and I'm truly humbled to be with you this evening. I call the book "This Changes Everything" because there are no non-radical options left on the table. We need to start. Now, what I mean by that is that our most establishment institutions, not just 97% of climate scientists, but the World Bank, PricewaterhouseCoopers, the International Monetary Fund, the International Energy Agency, are telling us in report after report that if we continue with what they call business as usual, we are on a trajectory towards 4 to 6 degrees of warming above pre-industrial levels, 4 to 6 degrees Celsius. Right where we're at right now is we've already raised temperatures by 0.7 or 0.8. And they're saying we're on a road to 6, okay? There are no climate models that can tell you what that means. Things go completely nonlinear at that point. So if we do what we're doing now, we don't have to do anything special to end up at that radical place. All we have to do is just keep on keeping on. And then everything changes about our physical world. In the face of that, we now have some very serious people telling us that the solution to this is deliberately interfering with the climate systems and trying to dim the sun by spraying sulfur into the stratosphere, or seeding the oceans. And actually, I start the book with an epigraph, a couple of them, but I want to read one in particular from the science fiction writer Kim Stanley Robinson, because I think it's really relevant. The wonderful science fiction writer Kim Stanley Robinson, really relevant to our discussion here. In my books, I've imagined people salting the Gulf Stream, damming the glaciers sliding off the Greenland ice cap, pumping ocean water into the dry basins of the Sahara and Asia to create salt seas, pumping melted ice from Antarctica north to provide fresh water, genetically engineering bacteria to sequester more carbon in the roots of trees, raising Florida 30 feet to get it back above water, and, hardest of all, comprehensively changing capitalism. The reason I started with this is something we all know, that for our elites, it is easier to imagine turning down the sun and taking the enormous risks that go with that than it is changing the rules of our economic system that have benefited them most of all. But the truth is that for the rest of us, we would generally much rather put solar panels on our roofs than turn down the sun, even if in order to switch to renewable energy on the scale that is required, it would require changing pretty much everything about our economic and political system, and indeed it would. So these are the choices that we have before us. This is why climate change changes everything. It'll either change everything about our physical world, or we need to change everything about our political and economic sphere to make the changes that are required necessary. The issue is not that we don't know what the policies are. The issue is not that we don't have the technology. It is, and this is, the central argument in the first part of the book, is that doing what needs to be done in the face of the climate crisis clashes directly with the logic of neoliberal capitalism that we exist within. And that has been a really big problem, and that, I would argue, is the reason why, since our government started negotiating towards a climate solution, which began in 1990, global emissions have gone up by 61%. So obviously this process has not worked. And the argument I make is that the reason for that, what explains this more than anything else, is an epic case of bad timing. And that is because this crisis hit us, it came to mainstream consciousness at the tail end of the 1980s. That was when we lost all plausible deniability. That's when James Hansen testified before Congress and said that he now had, with a high degree of certainty, he could now connect CO2 emissions with warming. And it was that moment when the editors of Time magazine, when they had to choose their man of the year for 1988, chose Planet Earth, this planet in peril. And there was this moment where it was like, we're all going to come together, and it was this momentum that led to the Rio Summit and the signing of the first climate convention. But if we look back at what else was happening in 1988, it's really revealing. Okay, so this was the turning point. This was, okay, this is your problem. Well, that was the year the first free trade agreement was signed between Canada and the US, the agreement that would later be turned into NAFTA, which really triggered the whole globalization era and eventually the creation of the World Trade Organization. 1 year after Hansen testified, the Berlin Wall collapsed. History was declared over. This was the moment when we were all being told that there was no alternative to privatization, deregulation, cuts to government spending, tax cuts, free trade. We've been living it, we've been breathing it. This is why it is so tragic that the left has ceded the climate discussion to the environmentalists, because we should have understood this fundamental clash. And I include myself in this. I think it took too long. I still don't quite understand why it took us so long. But when we look back on it, it is very clear that you have a direct clash between what was happening in the economic sphere and what was happening in those climate negotiations, which were each pretending that the other didn't exist. So for instance, I live in Ontario, and Ontario has a really ambitious green energy plan. It was adopted in the midst of the financial crisis. It was adopted in 2009, not just as a climate plan, but also as a job creation strategy, because Ontario was being decimated by the collapse of the big three automakers and all of these plant closures. So, as part of setting very ambitious emission reduction targets, our government also announced that anybody who wanted to benefit from the green energy program had to make the stuff in Ontario. Not all of it, but around 40 to 60% of it. So all these solar panel factories opened up and wind turbine factories opened up, and 31,000 manufacturing jobs were created. It was a good program. And it worked. It worked from a climate perspective, and it worked from a jobs perspective. This was all going very, very well. Solar panel factories opening up and closed down auto parts plants, you know, exactly the image that you want of this changing economy. And then Japan and the European Union took Canada to the World Trade Organization and said, this is illegal. It is illegal for you to build a local industry deliberately. It's illegal for you to plan your economy because you're discriminating against our companies. Right? And of course, this was the essence of the battles we had over free trade. And now what we're seeing is it is sabotaging, indeed sabotaging, some of the most important climate actions in the world. And you often hear Americans say, oh, well, it doesn't matter what we do because China's just going to, you know, burn all the coal anyway. Well, the US government has challenged China's green energy programs at the WTO, as well as India's programs. It's precisely because they support local industry, and this was seen as violating WTO rules. So, you know, at the summit, these governments will all be pointing fingers at each other and saying that you're not ambitious enough and you're not ambitious enough. And in fact, what they're all doing is rushing to the World Trade Organization and trying to knock down each other's windmills, which is just extraordinary, and you see that clash. The other place where you see the clash between neoliberalism and what we need to do to respond to the climate crisis is in the frenzy of privatization that took place starting in the 80s and 90s, when we lost control of so many essential parts of our economy, of energy, of electricity, of transportation, of the key sectors that we need to transform right now. What's exciting is that as people decide to change their energy systems away from nuclear and away from fossil fuels, they are realizing that they also need to take back control over their electricity grids, over their power systems. You know, we often hear about how incredible it is that Germany now has 25% of its electricity supplied by renewable energy, much of it decentralized wind and solar, much of it coming from cooperatives, 900 new energy cooperatives in Germany that have sprung up just in the past decade, many small-scale, democratically controlled renewable energy utilities. What we don't hear about is that this is happening because in hundreds of cities and towns, people have decided to take back their electricity grids from the private companies that bought them in the 1990s. And they've done this because the profit motive of these companies and their desire for short-term results directly clashed with the public's desire to be part of this energy transformation. It's also happening closer to home, the city of Boulder, Colorado. Same thing. They remunicipalized. They're in the process of remunicipalizing their power. And this is coming up in Santa Fe. This is coming up in lots of cities. And it's interesting because it isn't starting from an ideological perspective. It isn't starting from people going, I'm anti-privatization. It's starting from the perspective of people wanting to get off fossil fuels and realizing that they can't do it unless they get democratic control over their energy systems. You know, nowhere is the clash clearer between this ideology that we're all living with and the climate imperative than when we're talking about austerity, right? I mean, there was this incredible moment where Britain had historic flooding this past year. In the middle of it all, huge parts of the country underwater, many areas were stranded, they were cut off by rail for weeks, the lights were out. This became a problem for David Cameron because it turned out that he had gutted the agency that was responsible for flooding and storm defense, knowing full well, despite all the warnings from the scientists, that flooding would be one of the effects of climate change in the UK, increased flooding. He had laid off more than 1,000 people, and 1,500 more people had their jobs on the chopping block. I think The Guardian reported that 300 flood defense programs had been canceled. So you see directly how the logic of austerity is just incompatible with what we need to do simply to protect ourselves from the climate change that we've already locked in. In Greece, the firefighters don't have spare tires to get into forest fires to fight them. And that, is leaving aside the massive public investments that we need to make to get off fossil fuels, to keep us, to get us off this 4 to 6 degree warming road. And that means huge investments in public transit and huge investments in the kind of renewable energy, decentralized renewable energy that I was talking about earlier, energy efficiency programs. All of this takes the kind of public sector investment that has been out of fashion for a very long time. And of course, deregulation, as part of that, the corporate takeover of politics, is another rather large problem, seeing as the fossil fuel companies have informed us that they plan to dig up 5 times more carbon than the atmosphere can safely absorb and stay below 2 degrees warming, or give us a 50-50 chance to stay below 2 degrees warming. So obviously we have to say no, but we have politicians that don't know how to say no. They have lost that art. There's Obama taking 3 years to just figure out how to say no to the Keystone XL pipeline, and I fully expect him to leave office without having made that decision. So we will not win. There are these sort of false debates going on about, is it reformist policies or is it radical policies? Do we need revolution or do we just need, a carbon tax? The bottom line is we're not going to get any of it unless we confront this brutal logic of market fundamentalism, unless we have a radical shift in the values that govern society. Because right now, they're standing in the way of everything. Now, the way I've laid this out, this clash between neoliberalism and sensible climate policies in these key years, might make it tempting to conclude that all we need to do is return to a mixed Keynesian economy that just invested more in the public sector and regulated corporations. Now, this is something that we have to understand, and this is why climate change changes everything. That boat has sailed. If we had acted in 1988 or 1990 or even 1992, it is possible that there could have been a reformist path to get off fossil fuels. But we didn't act. Our emissions are up 61%. And there is, as Michael Mann says, the Penn State climate scientist who wrote The Hockey Stick and the Climate Wars, there's a procrastination penalty. Okay, the procrastination penalty is this inconvenient fact that fossil fuels, once emitted, stick around and continue to trap heat relentlessly. So what that means is that we have blown pretty much our global carbon budget. So if we want to avoid catastrophic warming, we now need to cut our emissions in the global north by between 8 and 10% a year, according to leading scientists like Kevin Anderson and Alice Bowes at the Tyndall Center. Now, 8 to 9% a year is incompatible with the logic of economic growth as we know it. That doesn't mean that there can't be parts of our economy that will grow. They must. We have to grow in order to roll out these programs. We have to grow the low carbon parts of our economy, like education and caregiving and the arts and all of that. The problem is, as we do this, we're going to burn carbon. We are going to burn carbon as we try to get off carbon. And that means that we need to contract other parts of our economy if we're going to stay within our carbon budget. And all of this is deeply incompatible with the type of economy we have. I've been amazed by these, I think clearly our elites understand that we are on the verge of a radical shift because they keep putting out these reports, sponsored by like Bank of America or the International Monetary Fund, saying that we can get off, we can respond to climate change, and it'll be cheap and easy, it won't affect economic growth, and it'll be great for capitalism. It's so amazing to me because one of these key reports was published by the International Monetary Fund. In the real world, what the International Monetary Fund does is it says to all the countries of southern Greece that in the name of economic growth, they need to slash their public spending. And the way that plays out is by slashing all of their green energy programs and deciding to drill for oil and gas. to get some quick and easy cash. So these institutions are fully locked within the real world way that growth plays out. And there's this strange way that our elites are sort of pretending not to understand the very economy that they are at the center of. So, I'm running out of time. So I just want to leave you with the thought. I know there's been lots of debates about tomorrow's march, and there's a range of feelings about it. I hope people are feeling good about it. I hope people are planning to come out for it. Are people planning to come out to march? It's not perfect. It's not going to be perfect. It's a reflection of where we're at, which is better than we were at a couple of years ago, and not where we need to be, okay? We're making progress. Anyone coming out to flood Wall Street on Monday? Exactly. We all need to go out on Monday. What?
Occupy the climate zone. Don't know about that, I'll tell you later.
Tell me later. Now, one of the critiques of the march is that it doesn't have a demand. It's just kind of saying, do something, right? It's expressing that sense of urgency. I do think it is important for us to express that urgency, to sound the people's alarm. But in so doing, we also need to be aware that urgency without a vision of our own can be dangerous. Okay? It can be used in very, very regressive ways. That was what my last book was about. If it's just about being scared, if it's just about spreading that fear, and reaching out to our leaders and saying, save us, we know what they'll try to save us with, right? They'll be saving us with toxic plans, nuclear power, land grabs, biofuel, geoengineering. That is not the kind of urgency we need. We need the urgency that will power all of our movements with the real existential crisis that we face, that it will put us on a science-based deadline. We've all been fighting for so long for a just economy. What climate change tells us is that we simply cannot afford to lose. We have to win now. So, this time we may be saying, do something. Next time we say, now we want everything. Thank you.